I'd been at Mill Hill for about 5 years, working for Neil in chemotherapy, and I could pretty much do what I was required to do. I mean, all the techniques that were used in the labs that we had to use in chemotherapy anyway, I could do them. And I had been offered a role in America. We had a visiting scientist, I think his name was Dr. Weinstein, and he spotted me and said, would I go over to America and set up and run his laboratory over there? Well, I didn't want to do that because, as I might have mentioned before, I'm not particularly ambitious. I had quite an interesting social life at the time, which I didn't want to stop, and so I didn't do that. But when in about 1965, we were doing a lot of cell counting down microscopes, and Neil Brown could see how much work this was, with 2 or 3 of us around the place spending at least half a day going to sleep on tops of binocular microscopes trying to count these cells. And it's very tedious, you know, hundreds and hundreds of fields, 200 cells per field, and it went on all afternoon. And he thought, and we were using these little tally counters, you remember these little grey things that you press a button, it just clocked up numbers to do the counting. It was pretty primitive technique. And he wondered if there was some way that this could be aided with some technology. And he went to John Lewin, who was at that time running the electronics facility, and said to him, could he think of anything that would help this? And John said yes, he could, but he hadn't got time to do it. So Neil Brown said, well, you know, John Marsh hasn't got much to do, he could come and help you. So I don't think John Lewin thought much of that, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And I went up to the 6th floor that was on, where electronics was based, in a little room in the attic, and was introduced to John. And I used to go up there about half of my time to start working on this cell counter, which was excellent because nobody knew where I was. Neil thought I was upstairs and John Lewin thought I was downstairs. Wonderful. However, I did learn a lot from John, and we built the first synchronous counter. The synchronous, this is what it was called, the cell counter was called a synchronous counter. There are 2 things that make it important. First, it was the thing that got me into electronics, and secondly, it was designed and built in about 1965, and I think up until about a year or 2 ago they were still being used, which is pretty long-lived for a piece of technology used in the lab like that. I'm not sure that there are many other things. The very first ones that we ever built were still being used, and I managed to get one from parasitology recently. I've got it in my garage now. After I'd been working with John Lewin for about 6 months, and I'd been getting on quite well, I went to see Jack Perkins, and he said to me, would you be interested in working up here all the time and moving from chemotherapy into electronics? And I said, well, I thought I would, because I thought it was more interesting and more challenging. As I've already mentioned, I could do all the technical things that were needed that I had to do for Neil. I wasn't particularly ambitious about becoming a superior JTO, actually like a sort of semi-scientist, thinking up lines of research. I just wanted to provide a service, really, and I thought electronics, if I ever wanted to leave the institute, might be a better thing to be in, rather than knowing a lot about trypanosomasis, which I'm not sure many people outside the institute are particularly interested in. Well, certainly if they don't live in Africa, they're not interested. So I said, yes, I would like to move to electronics, and so I moved to electronics. Of course, I didn't know anything formally about electronics, and that meant I had to go back to part-time, to evening classes again, and I did an evening class in an ONC in physics and maths. Then I went on to do an HNC in what they called electronics, electrical engineering at Hendon Technical College, and eventually got an HNC in that, by which time I'd been working with John Lewin for about 3 years when that happened. That was about 1968 by the time I passed my HNC. And working with John Lewin was an absolute joy, because John was a very, very clever engineer.